Hey, folks, welcome to today's Law of Self-Defense show. I am, of course, attorney Andrew Branker for Law of Self-Defense. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. As many of you may know, I've been out most of the week with a cold, so I'm probably at about 80%. I'm going to structure today's show probably a little differently than I would do if I were healthy because I'm afraid I'm going to lose my voice partway through. So I'll start with the content that's, I think, most within my wheelhouse with respect to the topic of the day, and then perhaps touch on some ancillary topics as my voice holds out. And we are here today, of course, to talk about the massacre in Lewiston, Maine, by a man identified as Robert Card, and why these kinds of mass shooter scenarios are, in fact, the simplest use of defensive force scenarios that you could find yourself in. Now, importantly, I said simple. I did not say easy. So let me just make sure we're streaming everywhere we're supposed to be streaming, and then we'll launch into the formal initiation of today's show. And it looks like, yeah, okay. Looks like we are. Very good. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and launch today's show. Okay, folks. So before we jump into things, we do, of course, have a sponsor of today's show. And today, it's none other than Law of Self-Defense itself, particularly our book, The Law of Self-Defense Principles, which we are making available to all of you for free. Now, check out the book on Amazon. You'll see it's 5-star rated. I think something like 1,500 reviews. Very well-received book, a bestseller on Amazon in its category. But don't buy it on Amazon. Amazon will charge you $25 for the book, plus shipping and handling. We only ask that you cover the shipping and handling. The book itself is free. And you can take advantage of this at lawofselfdefense.com/free book. Folks, this is the owner's manual for how to defend yourself, your family, others, property, even against mass shooters lawfully, in plain English, based on actual law, not internet myth law. It's the Bible for this kind of thing, folks. So I urge you to take a look, and it's free, except for the cost of shipping the book to you at lawofselfdefense.com/free book. Okay, with that out of the way, let's take a look at what's going on up in Maine. And I'm not going to cover the details too much because it's still a developing situation. I believe the purported shooter here, one Robert Card, is still on the run. But let me share what we have as available updates at the moment, just so everybody's on the same page. And unfortunately, this is CNN. Sorry about that, folks. Sometimes that's all you have to work with, or it's easiest for me. Let's see. Let me pull this over here. So Lewiston, Maine, a small town. I think it's about 30,000 people, 35,000 people up in Maine. 2 days ago, October 25th, was the subject of a massacre. So far, we know 18 people are dead, 13 more injured, when a man identified as Robert Card went into a bowling alley and some other facilities with an AR rifle and just started murdering people. He apparently is still on the run. I've read, although I've not verified myself, that he is a veteran, at least a reservist veteran. He was trained as a firearms instructor. And of course, we can see in the few photos we've seen that he was armed with a AR pattern rifle. Now, a few of these facts will be relevant when I get to some of the tactical considerations, if I get to tactical considerations, if my voice holds out that long. But first, I want to talk about what's really in my wheelhouse, which is the legal considerations here, and why a mass shooter event is one of the simplest, not easiest, but simplest self-defense scenarios you might find yourself involved in. And for that, I don't need CNN. So, where many law-abiding people, get in trouble in their use of force events is in what I call the zone of ambiguity. Now, we tend not to get in trouble on the extreme ends of the use of force continuum, right? When there's no apparent threat, we just go about our day. If someone steps out of a doorway and charges at us with a raised machete, well, that's not a complicated legal analysis, right? You just immediately solve that problem. But it's between those two extremes, the area I call the zone of ambiguity, where people like us, law-abiding defenders, tend to get into trouble. And that zone of ambiguity has to be evaluated from two different perspectives. One is the defender's perspective. The defender's perceptions of what's happening may be ambiguous. It may not be clear to the defender that there's a threat, or how much of a threat, or what degree of threat, non-deadly force or deadly force. That's, of course, the element of proportionality. So it makes it difficult for the defender to engage in decisive decision-making and actions in self-defense, because they can't decide based on the information available to them what's going on, how much is going on, and therefore they can't decide how much they'd be legally privileged to do in defense against this speculative threat, possible threat. And a scenario I often use to describe this is a woman in a parking garage late at night. She's had to work late. Everyone else in the office is left. It's dark out. Now she's walking through the parking garage to get to her car. Not many cars left in the parking garage at this time of night. And she realizes there's some dude she doesn't recognize who's walking about 30, 40 feet behind her. And he almost seems to be tracing her path. And he's not dressed very well. And she's getting a bad vibe from this dude. Bad vibe. It's scary. She's frightened. Good for her. She's got a pistol. So she has the means to defend herself with deadly force. Unfortunately, this dude hasn't yet done anything from which a reasonable person could infer that he's an imminent deadly force threat. Maybe he parked in the parking garage too. Maybe his car happens to be just near where her car is. Maybe he appears to be following the same path as her out of coincidence. But she's scared. She's scared because maybe that's not true. Maybe he is a threat. It's ambiguous. She doesn't know what she should do. She can't just turn around and shoot him now because he hasn't really done anything yet that would warrant being shot in self-defense. So what can she do? Well, she can remove the ambiguity from the situation. For example, she can turn around, point at that dude and say, "Stay the F away from me." Because if he is just a normal dude whose car happens to be parked by hers, and he's just following in her tracks by coincidence, and a woman in front of him turns around and starts shouting commands like that, what's he going to do? What would any of us normal guys do? We'd say, "Holy cow, she's crazy, right? I'm not going anywhere near her. Go ahead, ma'am, go on your way. I don't want any trouble." But if he's an aggressor, and he continues to close on her, even though she's shouting commands at him to stay away, is that conduct consistent with someone who's an imminent deadly force threat? Or at least an imminent threat, right? The deadly force may still be ambiguous. We're not sure yet. And remember how we evaluate imminence, right? Ability, opportunity, jeopardy, the AOJ triad. Even if you don't see a weapon, he's got the ability to cause some degree of harm. Excuse me, folks, my voice is going already. Give me a second. This may be a quick show. He's got fists, right? He's got feet. So he has the ability to cause some degree of harm. Opportunity. Does he have the opportunity to bring that ability to bear? Well, it depends on whether he closes distance or not. And if he's doing that despite commands, he's certainly trying to develop the opportunity. Jeopardy. Is he conducting himself in such a way that a reasonable person would infer he intends to bring the ability and opportunity to bear? Well, if he's advancing on a woman shouting at him to stay away, is that conduct consistent with jeopardy? Sure it is. And once you have AOJ, you have an imminent threat. Then the next question would be, is it a deadly force threat? That's a separate question I don't want to get into today because I'm not sure how long my voice will hold out. The point is, the woman has tools like verbal commands that she can use to strip the ambiguity out of the situation. Another context in which ambiguity gets people in trouble frequently is in defense of other situations. So you are You turn a corner, you see a couple people fighting. One of them appears to be losing the fight. Well, the law says you can come to the defense of other people. But the truth is, in any defense of other situation, unless you saw the start of the fight and have a lot of context, you don't really know what's going on. You don't really know who was the initial aggressor. You just don't know. These are strangers to you. Now, that's mitigated quite a bit if they're not strangers to you, right? If the person who appears to be losing the fight is a family member or a work colleague or a good friend, somebody about whom you know something of their character, right? Are they likely to be an unlawful aggressor in a fight? That can mitigate that risk. But if we're talking just a stranger is being attacked by someone and you intervene, you don't really know if you're intervening on the part of the lawful person or not. Maybe that person actually was the initial aggressor and just happens to be losing the fight in this moment. So again, ambiguity risk gets people in trouble in that defense of other situation. That's different. That defense of other situation is different than a mass shooter situation. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. I mentioned earlier that the ambiguity risk has to be perceived from two perspectives. One, we've already discussed, is you may be feeling ambiguous about what's happening. You're unsure about what's happening. I should have made this a members only show, given how painful this is. So you may be feeling ambiguous about what's happening. You're unsure. And there's things you can do to kind of strip away the ambiguities we've already discussed. But we also have to evaluate the risk of ambiguity from a second perspective, and that is the perspective of people evaluating your use of force, right? Because you don't have to ask anyone's permission to defend yourself, even with deadly force. Beforehand, you make that decision in an instant without having to first turn to anybody else for their approval. But all the permission you don't have to ask for ahead of time is more than made up for by the introspection you will be subject to after the fact. The police, the prosecution, a judge, a jury, all of those people will be evaluating whether or not they believe your use of force was lawful. And it's their belief that controls your legal outcome, not your belief. So you may have been involved in a use of force event where there was no ambiguity for you. Say it's the guy who steps out of the doorway with the raised machete. Not complicated. You just have to solve that problem. It's clearly an imminent deadly force threat. You solve it with deadly defensive force. Sorry, folks. So the guy with the machete is not a complicated legal problem for you in the moment. It's completely unambiguous. This is an imminent deadly force threat against which you defend yourself with deadly defensive force. But say by the time the police show up to the scene, someone's come and taken away the machete. They just scooped it up and went off with it before the police could recover it in evidence. Now you tell your story to the police and the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury. Why'd you shoot that guy? Why'd you kill that man? Well, he was coming at me with a machete. And they say, but we never found any machete. You know it existed. You saw it. So the situation is unambiguous to you, but it's ambiguous to them because a key piece of evidence is not in the record. It's one of the things we talk about when we talk about interacting with the police and the aftermath of a use of force event, the importance of making sure that exculpatory evidence is captured into the record and doesn't just disappear, because if it's not captured in evidence, it doesn't exist for legal purposes, folks. So if a key piece of exculpatory evidence disappears, and that machete is why you shot that guy, and if that disappears, well, then it looks like a much more ambiguous situation, because all these people, the police, the prosecutor, the judge, the jury, none of them were there when you defended yourself. They're not eyewitnesses. Maybe nobody was an eyewitness. Maybe there were no cameras. Maybe it's only your word and a dead guy. And then that key piece of evidence disappears. So what was an unambiguous scenario to you becomes a very ambiguous scenario to the people in whose hands your fate rests, your legal fate, whether or not you'll spend the rest of your life in a cage. So that's another form of ambiguity risk. Now, how are mass shooting events different from more common self-defense scenarios? The key difference, folks, is that there is no ambiguity. There's no ambiguity for you, and there's no ambiguity for the people who are evaluating your use of force afterwards. Because if you have a guy going through a bowling alley, just potting people with an AR, there's no ambiguity in your mind about what's happening as you observe this massacre. And when the authorities show up, and there's a bunch of people who've been killed by an AR, and let's imagine that you managed to neutralize the mass shooter with your concealed carry pistol. You didn't shoot all those people. He did. He's the guy. There's the body with the AR next to it. So there's no ambiguity for the authorities either. If you intervene in a mass shooter event, it's effectively the lowest legal risk self-defense scenario you could find yourself in. Crystal clear about what's happening. So, having said that, as I cautioned at the beginning, it's the simplest self-defense scenario you could find yourself in. That doesn't mean it's the easiest self-defense scenario you could find yourself in. In fact, it's among the most dangerous from a tactical perspective, not from a legal perspective. But of course, the tactical matters, right? I mean, we are the law of self-defense here, but I always tell people that the physical fight has to be the top priority, right? If you don't win the physical fight, all the legal stuff becomes rather less important. And the tactical challenges in engaging with a mass shooter, particularly one armed with a long gun, like an AR pattern rifle, are considerable, folks. It's, most concealed carry pistols, the one I carry, has about a 3.5-inch barrel. It can shoot accurately. The gun can shoot accurately at distance, but whether or not the person handling the gun can shoot accurately at distance is a different question. And if you're in a bowling alley, we've all been in bowling alleys, right? From one end of that bowling alley to the other, that's not 10 yards or 15 yards. That could be 100 yards. Well, who knows? I don't know. 75 yards. A long distance for a pistol shot, especially a typical concealed carry pistol. In contrast, the murderer armed with the AR, that distance is nothing to a long gun. So when my oldest daughter was 12 years old, I took her to the range and had her fire my AR. And it had a dot on it. And we put a human silhouette target out at 100 yards. And that 12-year-old with that AR and a dot could hit the head of that silhouette target all day long at 100 yards. Effortless. So if a 12-year-old can have that level of proficiency the first time they've ever fired an AR rifle, what do you think someone who's a firearms trainer can do with that platform at 50 yards or 75 yards? It's not a very fair matchup when the concealed carrier has a pistol with a 3.5-inch barrel. I'm not telling you not to intervene in these kinds of events, folks. I don't tell people what to do or not to do. I just want you to make informed decisions. And this may inform your decision about what you carry for personal protection. For example, there's long slide Glocks that are normally thought of as for competition. They have closer to a 5.5-inch barrel. And I know people who carry that long slide Glock for personal protection. A very well-known firearms instructor, Tom Gibbons, I believe, carries that pistol for personal protection. It's a pretty big darn gun. I carried a 1911 with a 5-inch barrel for 25 years. So it can be done, but it can be a little less convenient on a day-to-day basis when carrying a shorter barrel gun for concealed carry. Now, it's not so much that the barrel length, the longer barrel length makes the gun more accurate. I have little Smith & Wesson 38 special revolvers with, it's like a 1-inch barrel that are nail drivers. They're incredibly accurate. The gun itself is mechanically, but it's more difficult to shoot accurately. Part of that might be the sight radius, for example. So when the sights are very close together, it's much harder to be accurate at distance than when the sights are, 5.5 inches apart, like on that Glock long slide. Now, if you put a dot on your gun, that helps ameliorate the slide length issue because the dot should be on no matter what the barrel length. The barrel length becomes largely irrelevant. But do you have a dot on your gun? Would you consider putting a dot on your gun? Because you might find yourself in a bowling alley with a 3.5-inch concealed carry pistol and somebody 50 yards away with a rifle. At that distance, do you expect to miss more than if they were closer. If you're going to be missing more, should you be carrying more ammo? Another whole magazine, maybe 2. Now, these are relatively rare events, these kinds of mass shooter massacres. I'm differentiating these from the normal multiple victim shootings, which tend to be urban gang crime type of shootings. And many of us don't live in those environments, so we're not particularly at risk of those kinds of events. But in this kind of event in Lewiston, of course, the massacre came to the bowlers. They were not putting themselves in what anybody would consider a high-risk environment. The high risk came to them. So these are all tactical considerations. And I know Will is in the chat. Will Parker, firearms instructor in Montana. By the way, my pistol came in, Will. Thank you very much. I just bought a pistol from Will. And it's guys like Will Parker that you want to go to for training on these tactical considerations. And frankly, developing the skills necessary to be effective in these kinds of tactical situations. There are very long pistol shots that are made effectively, for a pistol. But you need to know how to actually run a gun to make those hits. You're not just pointing the gun out in front of you and smashing the trigger and getting hits with a handgun at 30 yards, 40 yards, 50 yards. That's just not realistic. If you know how to run the gun, sure, you'll get a good percentage of hits even at those distances if you know what you're doing. So I would urge you to know what you're doing when it comes to those kind of tactical considerations. And by the way, don't presume that anybody else in that bowling alley is going to do anything. And again, I'm not telling you to do anything yourself. That's up to you to make that decision. But no one's coming to save you. There's no chance police will be there before a dozen people are killed, maybe including you. And by the way, that's another consideration from the tactical perspective. Whereas the legal risk may be low, the physical risk is quite high, partly from the mass shooter himself, obviously, but also just from the environment. Because who is going to show up eventually? Well, a bunch of cops with a bunch of guns. Looking for what? Looking for some dude in the bowling alley with a gun. Is that going to be you? Are they going to shoot you, mistakenly believing that you could have been the active shooter? We had that happen right here in Denver not long ago, where an active shooter with an AR made a false 911 call to set up an ambush for police that responded, killed the first cop who got there. But you know what? There was an armed citizen there with a concealed carry pistol, and that armed citizen shot and killed this murderer. And then the armed citizen bent over and picked up the murderer's rifle. And just at that moment, more cops turned the corner, saw him standing there with the rifle, and shot and killed him. Awful, but lawful. And these are risks we incur when we get engaged in these kinds of conflicts. Again, I'm not telling you to do it, to get engaged or not get engaged. I am urging you to think about it today. Don't try to make that decision in the moment. Think about today, under what circumstances you'd be prepared to intervene and train and prepare yourself accordingly. Legally, with stuff like this at lawselfdefense.com/free book, tactically with the kind of courses that Will Parker teaches. And Will, feel free to put your URL in the comments. So we have all those risks to consider. My voice is holding out a little longer, so I want to touch on some other facets too. Because, of course, every time one of these mass shootings happens, what do we see? We see the gun controllers, the progressive fascists who want to deny American citizens the privilege to keep and bear arms. We see them dancing in the blood of the victims. They will say that we have to ban all these assault weapons. Look at this horrible thing that happened. And folks, they're doing this not out of good intentions, most of them, but out of malice. They want to disarm you because you're much easier to control if they disarm you. And to the extent any of them are acting in goodwill, they're thinking like not very bright children. They're not engaged in critical thinking. They're not viewing both the positive and negative externalities of guns, because guns have negative externalities, right? They have negative consequences. Criminals get them. Mass shooters use them. Bad things happen with guns. And that's all the gun controllers look at. What they don't recognize is that good things happen with guns. So even if we set aside the founding fathers interest in the Second Amendment, which was primarily to hold off tyranny, we have the self-defense aspects. And people like Dr. John Lott will tell you that something upwards of 2 million times a year, law-abiding people use guns to protect themselves from criminal predation. I mean, it's a tragedy that 18 people were killed by this murderer. But are we balancing 18 people against the 2 million people who would have been unable to protect themselves against murder, rape, maiming, protect themselves or their wives or their children? Because the gun controllers managed to use the tragic death of 18 people to strip everybody else, every law-abiding citizen, of their right to keep and bear arms? There are almost certainly 100 million AR rifles in America, some of which I own myself, that 2 days ago didn't harm anybody unlawfully. So it's not the rifle, folks. No firearm ever has self-animated and gone and killed somebody. They can only kill when they're wielded by monsters. Kill in this kind of massacre. And by the way, this gentleman apparently, like virtually every other mass killer who's ever used rifles, particularly AR rifles, to kill multiple people, was known to be mentally ill. Do we have a gun problem, or do we have a mental illness problem in America and a refusal to adequately address the mentally ill, the identified mentally ill in society? I'm seeing news reports that this particular guy, Robert Card, identified as Robert Card, had informed military authorities that he was hearing voices and thinking about shooting things up. Maine has a red flag law, which I think those laws are unconstitutional. But if someone can be demonstrated in a court to be in imminent danger, deadly force danger to himself or others, he ought to be institutionalized, at least on a temporary basis, until he can be evaluated by a professional. That's different than just taking away someone's guns and leaving them free, which is what the red flag laws do. I think either the person is dangerous or they're not dangerous. And if they're dangerous, just taking guns away from them doesn't help much. We've seen mass murders with motor vehicles running through parades, right? So if the person's dangerous, you need to lock them up until you determine they're not dangerous anymore. You don't just leave them free and simply take their guns away. So I'm trying to think if there was anything else I wanted to touch on with all of that before my voice goes. I'm sure there is, folks, but as you can probably tell, I'm not quite 100% from this cold yet. So I'm going to limit, I think, I will look at the comments in the chat, in the member chat. And then if you're watching on YouTube, as always, I don't know why you would do this. We answer our members' questions and address their comments in the Law of Self-Defense member chat, because we live stream this show on the member dashboard, as well as on YouTube and other social media. Let's see. There we go. And those members pay only about 30 cents a day, less than $10 a month to be a Law of Self-Defense member. Get all your questions answered for free on the member dashboard. But if for some reason you're not a Law of Self-Defense member, you do also have the option of asking your question as a super chat on YouTube if it's a minimum of $10 super chat. Now, I don't know why you would do that, because it costs less than $10 to be a Law of Self-Defense member for a whole month rather than paying $10 a question. But if that's your preference, go ahead and do that. I would instead encourage you to become a Law of Self-Defense member, and you can do that very easily and very cheaply, folks. We have a 2-week trial membership for 99 cents. Unlimited Law of Self-Defense membership, 99 cents for 2 weeks at lawofselfdefense.com/trial. And if you stay a member, it's only the 30 cents a day, less than $10 a month to be a member after that. So that's what I would encourage you to do. And I'm going to take a look at the member chat right now. And maybe the members will trigger additional topics for me to cover. Let's see. Law self-defense member Clay says, as the crippled old man of the family, it's my job to slow the zombie hood down while the rest of the family heads the other way. So in this instance, I'd be trying to draw as much attention as possible with whatever sidearm I'm carrying. That's not an unreasonable proposition, folks. It wouldn't be the first time in history that's happened. Let's see. Law self-defense member lawful to shoot ? Says Maine doesn't have a red flag law. That could be true. I don't really do gun law, folks. I can tell you that mass shootings happen in states with red flag laws by people who were known to be mentally ill. Let's see. Lloyd says, hope you can get some rest and feel better, Andrew. Well, today's Friday. This is Friday's show. So hopefully over the weekend, I'll be 100% coming back on Monday. Let's see. Law self-defense member Andrew says, say you did shoot and stop them with your gun. What do you do immediately after to avoid them not seeing you as a threat? The first thing I would do is get my gun out of sight. Out of sight, and posture myself in as little threatening position as I can. Excuse me, folks. Inoffensive means, hands in sight, not necessarily hands up. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, but you want your hands in sight, visible. That's the main thing the cops are going to be looking for, and you absolutely do not want a weapon in your hand. That is an excellent way to get shot. Let's see. Oh, yes, this is a good point. I'm glad this was brought up because I meant to talk about this. James, Law Self-Defense member James says, has anyone yet mentioned both murder locations were gun-free zones? I know for certain the bowling alley was a gun-free zone because I've seen a photo of the front door of the establishment and it has a no guns policy on the door. I'm not sure about the second major location. But obviously, anyone willing to commit this kind of massacre is not going to be deterred by a no gun sign. Right? Who's deterred by no gun signs? Well, the law abiding. So all you've done is create a target-rich environment for this kind of massacre. And of course, we've seen other shootings, particularly movie theater shootings, right here in Colorado, actually, where the bad guy drove past many theaters to get to his target theater because the target theater was no guns. So he would have a higher probability that he wouldn't be facing a defensive gun. By the way, I should also mention, sorry, folks, the cold is a little bit of cold brain. I could also mention, oh, good heavens. In almost all these mass shooter events, what stops the mass shooting? When does the murder stop? The murder stops the moment a good guy with a gun shows up and the murderer is aware that he's present. Sometimes the murderer is aware he's present because the good guy shoots him. But often it's the mere presence of the good guy with the gun. The murderer knows, all right, the gig's up, and often the murderer will just kill himself. So the mere presence of the good guy with the gun is typically what stops the murder. Often the good guy doesn't have to even shoot the mass murderer because the mass murderer takes care of that himself. Another good reason for us to have many, 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 many law-abiding people out in the population lawfully carrying weapons to deal with this kind of scenario. Let's see. I also don't really understand these no carry in bars laws. Doesn't make any sense to me. If you're worried about drunk people handling guns, well, then just make it you can't be intoxicated while you're handling a gun. But you can be in a bar or a restaurant that serves alcohol and not drink alcohol. So if you're not drinking alcohol, there's nothing magical about being in the setting of a bar that makes your carrying of an otherwise lawfully concealed pistol more dangerous or somehow unlawful, except for the fact, of course, that they make it unlawful by passing these kinds of laws. Let's see. Law self-defense member BigP says, sometimes hard to be sure who the shooter is in such a situation. Don't want to kill an innocent person. I'm not sure what you're referring there to, but if you see a guy walking around a bowling alley with an AR potting people, it's not that hard to know who the shooter is, right? Even if you just turned a corner and saw that happening, there's no explanation of that conduct that's consistent with a lawful use of self-defense, lawful use of deadly force. All right. Let me take a look at the super chats just to see if anyone was silly enough to do that. I hope not. I hope instead you would become a Law of Self-Defense member. That would be the smart play. Let's see. There's none from today. There's one from yesterday, but I don't understand what he's trying to say. But I'll read it. Cycle Boy, $10 super chat. Thank you very much. And he did post it in response to my loading today's show up on YouTube, which of course I did last night. It says, Andrew, sober watchdog laws, sober equals gun okay, must have. I mean, what can I tell you, folks? I carry a gun every day, have my entire adult life. Never came close to needing it. For most problems, the gun is not the answer. The gun's almost never the answer. But when the gun is the answer, chances are only a gun is an adequate answer. Right? Kind words are not going to stop a mass shooter. Social workers are not going to stop a mass shooter. What we should have done, of course, is this guy should have been institutionalized before this was ever allowed to happen. All right, last look at the Law of Self-Defense member comments and questions. I think we have it all. All right, folks. So I made it. I made it to the end. 37 minutes in. I appreciate your patience with the coughing and the hacking and the sipping of the tea. Hopefully by Monday, I'm back in 100%. And until then, I'll just remind all of you that if you carry a gun, so you're hard to kill, that's why I carry a gun, so I'm hard to kill, so my family is hard to kill. It's why I carry a knife. It's why I carry pepper spray. It's why I practice BJJ, although not this past week because I've been sick. If you do those kinds of things so you're hard to kill, so your family is hard to kill, then you also owe it to yourself and your family to make sure you know the law so you're hard to convict as well. Until next time, I remain attorney Andrew Branca for Law of Self-Defense. Stay safe.